The reading of the will was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in March, and by the time I walked into that conference room, I already knew something was very wrong. I'd felt it for weeks. Actually, ever since the hospice nurses had started coming to the house more frequently. Ever since my husband Gerald started having those hushed phone calls with his sons from his first marriage, calls that stopped the moment I walked into the room. Ever since his eldest, Philip, had started CCing himself on Gerald's emails without asking. But I'd told myself I was being paranoid. That grief does strange things to the mind. That after 24 years of marriage to a man I loved completely, I had no reason to feel afraid. I was wrong about that last part. My name is Lorraine Ashford. I'm 64 years old. I spent most of my adult life as a pediatric occupational therapist in Asheville, North Carolina, which means I gave up my career at 48 when Gerald asked me to come work alongside him managing his real estate holdings and his charitable foundation. I don't say that to complain. I loved the work. I loved our life. But it does mean I walked away from my professional identity, my pension, my independence, all of it, because I trusted that man with everything I had. Gerald Ashford was 71 when he died. He'd been healthy right up until the diagnosis, stage 4 pancreatic cancer. Discovered almost by accident during a routine scan for something else entirely. We had 8 months from diagnosis to the end. 8 months that felt simultaneously like 8 minutes and 8 decades. His sons, Philip and Derek, were 47 and 43 respectively. Philip was an estate attorney in Charlotte, and yes, I always found that particular detail to be deeply ironic. Given everything that happened, Derek ran a property management company in Raleigh that had, as I would later discover, been struggling quietly for years. Neither of them had been close to Gerald before his diagnosis. Philip called on major holidays and birthdays. Derek was a little warmer. But they'd had a falling out over money about 5 years back that Gerald never fully explained to me. He just said it had been handled and changed the subject whenever I brought it up. But the moment the doctors gave us that 8-month window, those sons materialized like they'd been waiting in the wings all along. Philip arrived first, about 2 weeks after the diagnosis, with his wife Tamara and their 3 kids. I'd cooked a real meal, roast chicken, green beans from the garden, the kind of dinner Gerald loved, and I'd tried to be genuinely welcoming. They were his children. His illness had scared them into reconnecting. I wanted to believe that. Lorraine, Philip said over dinner, helping himself to a second serving without asking. I've been thinking about Dad's affairs. Given the complexity of his holdings, I really think he should have professional guidance in updating his estate documents. Gerald looked at me across the table, and I saw something flicker across his face. Not surprise, more like recognition. My affairs are in good order, son, he said mildly. Of course they are, Philip said, but things change. Tax laws, property values. It's just smart to have everything reviewed. That was the beginning. Over the following months, Philip and Derek were suddenly everywhere. They helped Gerald to his doctor's appointments, something I'd been doing alone for weeks. They took him to lunch on days when he was feeling stronger. They sat with him in his study and had long conversations that ended when I appeared in the doorway. I tried not to feel threatened. I genuinely tried. But there's something uniquely disorienting about watching 2 people insert themselves into your marriage with the patient efficiency of people who believe they're simply reclaiming what was always theirs. Gerald died on a cold Sunday in February. He passed at home, the way he wanted, with me holding his hand. Philip and Derek were in the living room. They came in afterward and stood at the foot of the bed and said appropriate things. They hugged me briefly. Then Philip said he'd been in contact with the estate attorney and they'd need to schedule the reading of the will as soon as possible. He said this the same day his father died. I didn't respond. I just looked at him. The reading was scheduled for a Tuesday morning. 12 days later, I sat on one side of the conference table at Caldwell & Associates, a different firm from the one Philip worked at, which gave me false comfort, and Philip and Derek sat across from me with their respective spouses. The attorney, a thin man named Howard Caldwell who had the apologetic manner of someone delivering bad news for a living, opened a leather portfolio and cleared his throat. And then he read. The house in Asheville. Our home. The place where Gerald and I had spent 24 years building a life together. Valued at approximately $1.1 million. Left jointly to Philip and Derek. The mountain cabin in Boone. The place where Gerald and I had gotten married in a small ceremony with 20 people and wildflowers everywhere. Left jointly to Philip and Derek. The real estate portfolio. 12 rental properties across western North Carolina with a combined estimated value of $2.3 million. Left jointly to Philip and Derek. The Ashford Family Foundation. The charitable organization I had helped build from a modest annual giving account into something that served over 800 families in Buncombe County. Left jointly to Philip and Derek. And for me, Gerald's wife of 24 years. A life insurance policy worth $175 and my personal belongings. That was it. I sat very still while Howard Caldwell finished reading. I could feel Philip and Derek watching me from across the table. Philip had the careful blankness of a man who had anticipated this moment and rehearsed his expression. Derek couldn't quite hide his relief. Lorraine, Philip said, when the attorney had closed the portfolio. I want you to know we intend to be completely fair about the transition. You can stay in the house for 60 days while you make arrangements. 60 days, in my home. There's also the matter of the foundation's administrative costs. Derek added, glancing at his brother. We've done a preliminary review of the financials. And there's some question about certain expenditures over the past few years. Nothing serious, but we'll need documentation. I looked at him. Are you suggesting I mismanaged the foundation? No, he said quickly. Just due diligence. Howard Caldwell was studying the table in front of him with the focused attention of a man who wished very much that he were somewhere else. I'll need to speak with my own attorney, I said. Of course, Philip said. That's completely appropriate. Take your time. His tone was the exact tone I'd heard him use with his children when he was letting them believe they had a choice while knowing they didn't. I drove home in silence. I sat in Gerald's chair in his study, the old wingback that he'd had since before we met. That smelled faintly of the cedar oil he used on it every few months, and I tried to understand what had just happened to my life. $175 and my personal belongings. 24 years. The study was exactly as Gerald had left it. His reading glasses on the side table. The novel he'd been working through. Bookmarked about 2/3 in. A mug he'd used the morning before he'd been too weak to come downstairs anymore. Which I hadn't been able to bring myself to wash. I sat there for a long time. Then I started looking through his desk. Not for anything specific, at first, just to feel close to him. To touch the things his hands had touched. But in the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of old tax documents and a collection of anniversary cards I'd written him over the years. He'd kept every single one. I found out, there was a sealed envelope. It had my name on it in his handwriting. Nothing else. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded into thirds. It said, Lorraine, the safe, behind the Wyeth print in the bedroom. The combination is the date we got married. I'm sorry I couldn't explain this in person. I needed you to be surprised. I love you more than I know how to say. Gee. My hands were shaking as I climbed the stairs. The print had hung in our bedroom for years, a quiet landscape. Gray-green hills, soft light. I'd always assumed Gerald had bought it because he liked it. I'd never thought to look behind it. The safe was small, built flush into the wall, painted to blend with the plaster. The combination worked on the first try. Inside was a USB drive and another envelope. The envelope was thicker than the first. The return address showed a law firm I'd never heard of, Whitmore and Garza. With an office address in Black Mountain, a small town about 20 minutes outside Asheville. I sat on the edge of the bed and opened it. Gerald had been planning this for the better part of a year. The documents were methodical, thorough, and absolutely devastating to everything Philip and Derek believed they'd inherited. The first item was a letter from Gerald, longer than the note in the desk. He'd written it 6 months before his death, when he was still strong enough to sit at a table for extended periods. My darling Lorraine, It began, "If you're reading this, then Philip and Derek have done exactly what I suspected they would do. I want to start by telling you that I am so deeply sorry for the fear and confusion you must be feeling right now. I also want to tell you that everything is going to be all right. Please read everything in this envelope before you do anything else." I read for 2 hours. Gerald had first grown suspicious of his sons about 9 months before his diagnosis. When Derek had asked him for a $200 loan to prop up his struggling property management business, Gerald had given it. 2 months later, Philip had mentioned, casually, over dinner, that it might be worth reviewing Gerald's estate plan given current market conditions. Gerald hadn't thought much of it at the time. But then came the diagnosis. And then came the attentiveness. Gerald was nobody's fool. He'd built his real estate portfolio from a single duplex he'd bought at 32. Adding properties carefully and methodically over 40 years. He understood how money made people behave. And something about the timing of his son's renewed interest, the way it aligned so precisely with his prognosis, made him start paying attention. He'd hired a private investigator named Rosemary Kincaid out of Morganton. She was quiet, efficient, and had 40 years of experience. Within 6 weeks, she'd given Gerald a picture of his son's finances that was considerably grimmer than anything he'd imagined. Philip's estate planning practice was technically solvent, but Philip himself had made a series of terrible investment decisions using borrowed money, including $340 in margin calls he'd been unable to meet. He owed creditors he hadn't told his wife about, and in at least 2 documented instances, Rosemary had found evidence suggesting Philip had directed elderly clients to revise their estate documents in ways that benefited Philip's referral network over the clients' actual families. Nothing that had risen to the level of charges yet, but close. Derek was worse. The loan from Gerald had not gone to his business. Bank records showed it had been transferred within 96 hours to a private account Derek held jointly with a woman who was not his wife. The property management business was being slowly hollowed out, rent deposits delayed, maintenance funds redirected, client accounts that didn't reconcile on inspection. Gerald had also discovered something about the will that Philip and Derek had been presenting at the reading. The firm, Caldwell and Associates, had prepared those documents 18 months earlier, before Gerald's diagnosis. But after a meeting that Philip had quietly arranged with Howard Caldwell without Gerald's knowledge, Philip had presented himself as acting on his father's behalf in a preliminary estate consultation. Caldwell, taking Philip at his word, had prepared a draft based on Philip's description of his father's wishes. Gerald had never seen that draft. He'd signed documents he'd been told were routine updates to his estate plan, documents he'd signed while Philip sat beside him, pointing to the signature lines, at a moment when Gerald had been tired and trusting and not yet aware of the full picture. By the time Gerald understood what had happened, it was done, and he was too ill to fight the legal battle himself. So he'd done the next best thing. He'd gone to Whitmore and Garza and had a new will executed, completely valid, completely current, witnessed by 3 independent parties and notarized with exacting care. He'd also spent the better part of 4 months restructuring his assets in ways that would make the old will effectively worthless even if Philip tried to use it. The real estate portfolio, valued at $2.3 million, had been transferred into a limited liability company called Ashford Property Group, LLC. Sole member, Lorraine Ashford. The transfer had been executed 8 months before Gerald's death and was fully documented. The mountain cabin in Boone had been deeded directly to me as a gift inter vivos, a legal gift made during Gerald's lifetime, 7 months before he died. It was already mine, had been for months. The Ashford Family Foundation had been restructured. Gerald had added 3 independent board members from the Asheville nonprofit community, people who knew the work and me, and had updated the bylaws so that the board, not any single heir, controlled succession of leadership. Gerald's letter of recommendation to the board named me as his preferred executive director. And the house. Our home. Gerald had taken out a $1.4 million home equity line of credit against the Asheville property 8 months before his death. The outstanding balance was $1.38 million. The house was worth $1.1 million. Anyone inheriting it would be inheriting a property worth less than the debt attached to it. The money from that line of credit was sitting in a brokerage account in my name. Fully transferred, fully documented. I closed the envelope and sat in the silence of our bedroom for a long time. Outside the window, the February light was the pale gold gray that only happens in the mountains just before spring. A cardinal landed on the fence at the edge of the garden and sat there for a moment. Very red against the gray sky. Before it flew away. "Oh, Gerald," I said to the empty room. He'd known he was dying and he'd spent his last good months building me a fortress brick by careful brick. He'd done it quietly, without telling me, because he'd been afraid that if I knew, I'd insist on fighting more openly, and a direct confrontation might have tipped his sons off before everything was in place. He'd trusted me to find the envelope. He'd trusted me to read carefully. He'd trusted me to make the right decisions once I understood the full picture. The USB drive contained scanned copies of everything, every document. Every bank record, every investigator's report, every deed and transfer. It also contained a short video file. I plugged the drive into my laptop and sat on the edge of the bed and opened it. Gerald was sitting in his study. In the wingback chair. He looked thinner than I was used to seeing him, even in the video, but his eyes were clear and he was smiling. "Hi, sweetheart," he said. "If you found this, you're doing better than I'd hoped. I always knew you were tougher than you thought you were." I pressed my hand over my mouth. "I want to tell you something," he continued. "I don't feel good about what I did with Philip and Derek. I want you to know that. They're my sons, and I love them, and I grieve for the men they might have been if they'd made different choices. But they made the choices they made, and I couldn't let those choices fall on you." He paused and looked off to the side for a moment. "The attorney at Whitmore and Garza is a woman named Christine Garza. She has everything. She's been instructed to contact you 30 days after my death if you haven't reached out to her first. I'm guessing you found this before then. Knowing you," he almost smiled, "call her Monday morning. She'll walk you through everything." He looked directly at the camera again. "I love you, Lorraine. Build something good. You've always known how." The video ended. I sat in the winter light of our bedroom and let myself cry for a while. Really cry. The way I hadn't been able to since the hospice nurses had come and there was always someone who needed something from me. I cried for Gerald and for the 8 months and for the marriage that had been everything I could have hoped for and for the strange and ugly thing that had happened around the edges of it while I was looking the other way. Then I dried my face, plugged in my phone, and found Christine Garza's number. She answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Ashford," she said, "I was expecting your call. Let me tell you what we're going to do." I met with Christine the following morning in her office in Black Mountain. A warm space with exposed brick and plants on every windowsill and the general feeling of a place where people came to solve real problems. Christine was in her early 50s. Compact and direct, with the kind of no-nonsense manner that inspired immediate confidence. She walked me through everything in the envelope with the patience of someone who understood that this was a lot to absorb. "The core of it is this," she said, when she'd finished the review. "The will your stepsons presented at the reading is a valid legal document. But it predates your husband's final testamentary instructions by 18 months. The will we executed is the controlling document. Your stepsons can challenge it, but they will lose. And given that your husband documented their attempt to manipulate his earlier estate plan, any challenge they bring opens them up to significant legal exposure." "What kind of exposure?" "Elder financial abuse. For one, Philip's conduct in directing his father to sign documents under false pretenses is a criminal matter in North Carolina." She opened a folder. "The investigator your husband hired was very thorough. Philip and Derek aren't in a position to pick a legal fight with you." I thought about sitting across from them in that conference room. About Derek's carefully measured relief. About Philip explaining to me that I'd have 60 days in my own home. "What happens when they find out?" I asked. Christine leaned back in her chair. "That's actually something I wanted to discuss with you. You have options. You could let them find out through formal legal channels. which would be slower but more controlled. Or you could invite them to a meeting, present the situation, and give them the opportunity to walk away without public exposure of the investigation records. Give them a choice. Of a sort, accept the reality of the estate as your husband actually structured it. Or face a legal challenge that brings Rosemary Kincaid's findings into the public record. She held my gaze. Your husband left that decision to you. He was very explicit about that. I thought about Gerald's letter. About the part where he'd said he grieved for the men his sons might have been. Schedule the meeting, I said, but I want Martin, my original attorney, present as well. I want everyone in the same room. Christine nodded and reached for her calendar. The meeting happened the following Thursday. I'd asked Howard Caldwell to invite Philip and Derek to a follow-up meeting at his office, telling him only that there were documents he needed to see before the probate process advanced further. Howard, to his credit, had been genuinely cooperative once Christine had shown him the evidence of how his earlier consultation with Philip had been misrepresented. He was embarrassed and he was scared, and both of those things made him useful. I arrived early and chose my seat deliberately, the one at the head of the table. Gerald's seat at every meeting they'd ever had in this building. Philip and Derek arrived together. As I'd expected, Philip was dressed for a legal proceeding. Dark suit, crisp shirt, the polished armor of a man who believes presentation is power. Derek looked somewhat less composed, his jacket slightly wrinkled, his eyes moving around the room. They stopped when they saw Christine. "Who is this?" Philip asked, looking at me. "Christine Garza, of Whitmore and Garza," Christine said pleasantly. "I represent Mrs. Ashford in matters relating to your father's estate." Philip's face went very still. Derek sat down heavily. "There seems to be some confusion," Philip said carefully, pulling out his chair. "My father's estate is being handled by Caldwell and Associates." "It was," Christine said, "but as you'll see from the documents in front of you, your father retained our firm approximately 14 months ago to execute his final testamentary instructions. The will you've been working from predates those instructions by 18 months. She slid copies across the table. Philip reached for his before she'd even finished speaking, his attorney's reflexes taking over. I watched his eyes move across the first page. "This isn't possible," he said. His voice was still controlled, but something underneath it had changed. "I'm afraid it is," Christine said. "The document you're holding was executed by your father on April the 9th of last year. Witnessed by 3 independent parties, all of whom are available to provide sworn testimony. It supersedes all prior testamentary documents." Derek was reading his copy more slowly. He was on page 3 when he went pale. "The properties," he said, "the portfolio, were transferred into Ashford Property Group, LLC, 8 months prior to your father's death." Christine confirmed. "Mrs. Ashford is the sole member. Those assets never entered the estate and are therefore not subject to distribution." Philip set his copy down on the table. He looked at me directly for the first time since he'd walked in. "You knew about this?" "I found out 3 days ago," I said. He was planning this the whole time. It wasn't a question. Something in Philip's expression had gone very flat, the professional composure stripped away to something rawer underneath. "Your father began this process about 9 months before his diagnosis," Christine said, "but he accelerated the planning considerably after the fall of last year. He was concerned about protecting Mrs. Ashford's interests." That's not," Derek started, then stopped. He looked like a man who had just stepped onto ice and felt it shift beneath him. "There's one more thing," Christine said. She pulled out another set of documents. "The investigator's report, the bank records, the documented evidence of what both men had done." She didn't narrate it, she just placed it on the table and let them read. The room was silent for a very long time. It was Philip who spoke first. His voice had lost all its practiced certainty. "What do you want?" I'd been thinking about this question since my conversation with Christine. Since the video of Gerald in his chair. Since the winter light through the bedroom window. "I want the probate process to reflect the accurate estate documents," I said. "I want the foundation to remain intact as my husband built it." I want the 60-day notice you gave me in my own home to be formally withdrawn. I paused. And I want you both to understand what your father knew. Not so that you feel ashamed. Though that's up to you. But because he deserved to be known clearly. Philip's jaw was tight, and the investigation records. If you cooperate fully with the probate process and make no attempt to challenge the documents, the investigation records remain private. Your father's choice was to handle this within the family. I'm choosing to honor that. Derek looked up. There were tears in his eyes. Which surprised me. He did all this, he said quietly. Even after everything. He did all this himself instead of. He stopped. Instead of calling the police. I finished. Yes, that was who he was. We sat in that room for another 40 minutes working through the mechanics of it. Christine and Howard Caldwell negotiating the language while Philip and Derek signed documents with the careful, beaten movements of men who understood they had no other options. Tamara, Philip's wife, had come and was sitting in the corner saying nothing. She'd been crying for most of the meeting. When it was over, Philip paused in the doorway on his way out. Lorraine, he said. He stopped there for a moment. As if you were trying to find something adequate. He didn't find it. He left. Derek came to me before he walked out. He was the one I'd always liked slightly better. The softer one. The one who'd seemed most uncomfortable at the reading of the will. I'd wondered since then whether he'd had doubts. Whether any part of him had tried to pull back. I'm sorry, he said. For what it's worth, I know it probably isn't. It's worth something, I said. Not enough, but something. He nodded and left. The mountain cabin in Boone was mine. Had been mine for 7 months. I drove up the following Saturday. The first weekend of March. With the car packed with things I'd been waiting to bring up. Gerald's favorite wool blanket. A case of good red wine. The framed photograph from our wedding that I'd taken off the wall the day after the original reading of the will and wrapped in a dish towel and held onto. I hung the photograph over the fireplace. I lit a fire and poured a glass of the wine and sat in the chair by the window that looked out over the ridge. I stayed there for a week. Hiking in the mornings. Reading in the afternoons. Sitting by the fire in the evenings with the photograph across from me and Gerald's blanket across my lap. I thought about the 60 days he'd given me to leave my own house. I thought about the phrase due diligence applied to 24 years of work I'd done for the foundation he'd spent months trying to protect. I thought about what it must have been like for Gerald to be sitting in his own dying and also watching what his sons were becoming. And to have to hold all of that alone while still being a good father. A good patient. A good husband. I thought about the video. I love you, Lorraine. Build something good. On the 4th day, I called the chair of the Ashford Family Foundation's newly expanded board. A woman named Dr. Patricia Vance, who ran a social services organization in East Asheville and who had worked with the foundation for years. Gerald had appointed her to the board 6 months before his death. I'm ready to come back, I told her. We've been waiting, she said. 3 months after the meeting in Caldwell's conference room, I returned to the foundation in an official capacity as executive director. The first major initiative I launched was an emergency legal services fund specifically for victims of family financial abuse, elderly adults and surviving spouses who'd been manipulated or defrauded by people who were supposed to love them. I named it the Gerald Ashford Fund for Financial Justice. Christine Garza agreed to sit on the advisory board. Rosemary Kincaid, the investigator, referred 3 clients in the first month. I received occasional updates through Christine about Philip and Derek. As their various legal and financial situations quietly unraveled, Philip's creditors eventually forced a negotiation that cost him his equity stake in the practice. Derek's business didn't survive the scrutiny that followed the probate process. Tamara filed for divorce in August. Derek moved back to Raleigh and, from what I heard, started working for a friend's landscaping company. I found that I didn't feel triumphant about any of it. Exactly, more like sad, in the way you feel sad about preventable things. Gerald had loved his sons. I believed that. I believed that right up until the end. In those final weeks when he was no longer strong enough to come downstairs. He had hoped they might surprise him. That the attentiveness might turn into something real. That love might eventually win out over greed. It hadn't, but he'd planned for that possibility with the same meticulous care he'd brought to everything in his life. He'd made sure that their failure to love him well couldn't destroy the person he'd loved most. I think about that sometimes. When I'm sitting on the porch of the mountain cabin watching the light change over the ridge. Or when I'm at my desk at the foundation going through grant applications from families who need exactly the kind of help I once needed and didn't know how to ask for. I think about what it means to love someone so practically. To love someone not just with words and gestures but with preparation and forethought and a USB drive hidden in a safe behind a Wyeth print. I think about the cardinal on the fence the morning I found Gerald's letter. How red it was against the February sky. How it sat there for just a moment and then was gone. Gerald always said that the most important decisions you ever make are the ones nobody sees you making. The ones that happen quietly. Over time. Without fanfare. The ones you make not because anyone's watching. But because you know in your bones that it's right. He spent the last year of his life making those decisions for me. The least I can do is spend the rest of mine being worthy of them. I think about all of you listening to my story. Too. I wonder how many of you have been in a room where someone smiled at you and you knew. Somewhere deep down, that the smile was not what it seemed. I wonder how many of you have had to choose between fighting loudly and planning quietly. Between the satisfaction of a direct confrontation and the longer, more patient work of building something that can't be taken from you. If you've been there, or if you're there right now, I want you to know something that took me longer than it should have to understand. The people who underestimate you are doing you the greatest favor of your life. Let them.